to an online event of the Affiliation of Christian Biologists and the Affiliation of Ministers, Theologians, and Philosophers, two divisions within the American Scientific Affiliation. My name is Brian Groyle, and I'm president of the ACB group. Tonight's event is the second of a series of 3 or perhaps 4 collaborative events that we are hosting on the broad topic of the human soul, human identity, and human consciousness. The seed of this series was planted at an ACB event last May, during the Q&A period, actually, following a presentation on human embryos by Jeff Harden from the University of Wisconsin. There were a lot of questions on the topic of the human soul and how that related to embryos. That sounded like a great idea, the topic of the human soul, for a collaborative seminar series with the Ministers, Philosophers, and Theologians group. And so, long story short, meeting with the ACB Vice President, Carl Pinkham, and Walter Rohiro, the president of the AMTAP group, we decided to go forward with that idea, and we began inviting prospective speakers. That led to the event last month with Joel B. Green from Fuller Theological Seminary, who gave a monist perspective on the human soul, and our invitation of tonight's speaker, who will be giving us a dualist perspective. We are delighted to have Dean W. Zimmerman as our guest speaker this evening. Dean is professor of philosophy and director of the Center for the Philosophy of Religion at Rutgers University. He is member of the Society of Christian Philosophers and holds the MA and PhD degrees in philosophy from Brown University, with specializations in metaphysics and philosophy of religion. His areas of interest include early 20th century analytic philosophy, philosophy of mind, and epistemology. He has authored numerous articles and co-edited several books and journal issues on these topics. Among them are Contemporary Debates in Metaphysics, published in 2008, Persons, Human and Divine, published in 2007, and The Personal Identity Issue of the Monist, published in 2004. He's currently writing a book on the philosophy of religion for the Princeton Foundations of Philosophy series. Now, one additional interesting factoid about Dean Zimmerman is that he is the keyboardist for the rock band Jigs and the Pigs. Now, to me, that sounds like an allusion to fly fishing, but what do I know? Maybe Dean will give us some background on his band's name. The title of Dean's presentation is Souls and Bodies, Philosophical and Theological Perspectives. Dean, great to have you join us this evening.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for welcoming a lowly philosopher into your company. So what I thought I would do is sort of simply be a philosopher and tell you why it is that a kind of substance dualism still seems plausible to me from a philosophical point of view, and then from a more theological point of view, why it still has a grip on me. Why I think it's a good thing that it's still plausible from a philosophical point of view. What I'm sharing won't be very scientific, I'm afraid, but at several points, an effort will be made to develop a kind of dualism that doesn't just fly in the face of the evolution of consciousness and the dependency of consciousness upon the brain. So I think we need to accept those things, and our dualism should respect them. So that will come up at some point, but I'm afraid this will be a philosophy talk, and I hope it'll be useful, uh, even though it's a philosophy talk. Um, so I'm calling it Who's Afraid of Dualism? Oh, I should probably go. You said 50 minutes? Was that 45, 50? Okay. Maybe I should have called this Why I'm Not Afraid of Dualism. All right. So here's the outline. The little intro section, and then I'm going to distinguish some kinds of dualisms and kinds of materialisms. Um, Identify a kind of dualism I call property dualism. I don't just call it that. Everybody calls it that. And show why it cuts against various forms of materialism and leaves a kind of traditional dualism looking not so bad. And then I'll talk about Christianity and dualism and then sum up. So, dualism in theological circles, especially, is kind of a dirty word. It's sort of like calling somebody a reactionary. It doesn't just mean you're a political conservative. It means that you're a knee-jerk type of conservative. You resist even reasonable reforms. So to be a dualist is not just to be someone who draws a distinction between two things. In a lot of people's usage, it means you're someone who draws a sharp distinction where there isn't one. You're someone who divides the world into two different categories when they're not really exhaustive or they don't really apply. Now, I want to use the word dualism as a term for a view about the nature of human beings. But I'm afraid that it's often used this way in this pejorative sense to mean something like an extreme Platonistic division between body and soul that is scientifically untenable, alien to biblical religion, and morally pernicious. So the Platonizing dualists for whom this label is reserved are supposed to think things like the soul is naturally immortal, that it's better off to be without your body. The body only drags us down and clouds our ability to think. This kind of dualist expects that we're going to live on as souls in heaven, happy forever in a disembodied state. And of course, that's a heresy according to every major strand of the Christian tradition, all of which emphasize the resurrection of our bodies. So if dualism is freighted with all of this Platonistic meaning, then I'm not a dualist. But I do want to draw a distinction between soul and body, or between myself and my body. I don't think souls are naturally immortal. I don't think they're better off without bodies, or that, barring a miracle, they can think without brains. But like Paul and other New Testament authors, and indeed Jesus has depicted in the Gospels, I do expect that a person exists in a disembodied form after death. But also, like them, I deny that this is the natural permanent state for which we were made. Rather, death is only really defeated by the resurrection, the reunion of soul and body. What I'm going to suggest is that kind of view isn't refuted by the discovery that thinking and personality are radically dependent upon the brain. And I don't think that if you hold this kind of view, you're inevitably going to denigrate bodily life or destroy the planet or anything like that. So I'd like to take dualism without all this kind of freight. I think it's when philosophers use it, they don't use it with all that negative stuff associated with it. I count as a dualist, even though I don't believe those things when philosophers are talking. Okay. So dualisms and materialisms. I'm going to distinguish a bunch of different views here, and hopefully you won't forget what they are before before it becomes important that we distinguish between them. In philosophy of mind, dualism can either mean what I'm going to call property dualism, or it can mean something stronger, a kind of substance dualism. And they're both important, and we need to distinguish carefully between them. So property dualism is the view that at least some of our mental states or mental properties are not entirely dependent upon our purely physical states or properties. Um, Substance dualism is the view that you and I are non-physical substances, that we don't have physical properties at all. Now, these are very different because you could be a dualist about mental states or properties, but be a materialist about persons, as shall appear. Uh, Now, property dualism is what I want to define first, and it's quite plausible, I think, when it comes to certain phenomenal properties that we experience, sometimes called qualia. I want to focus on um, phenomenal aspects of our experience. Um, so, what do I mean by that? Well, a mental state, if there's a mental state and there's a distinctive way that it feels to be in that state, then it's a phenomenal state. So it doesn't seem like there's any distinctive way that it feels to think about Vienna. I might picture Vienna differently than you do. I might think about Vienna and be happy one day and sad the next, or whatever. Um, but there is a distinctive way that it feels to see a stop sign or a bullfighter's cape or a red after image. Those all have something in common. There's a particular way that it feels. They're reddish experiences to me. And similarly for tastes, smells, headaches, sounds, lots of other uh, uh, would get lumped together and called phenomenal uh, experiences. Now, plausibly, the phenomenal is, in at least a limited sense, not entirely dependent upon the physical. At least there are popular philosophical arguments for the conclusion that the phenomenal is independent of the physical, and I'm going to clarify those arguments or clarify those terms, physical and dependent, in describing these arguments. Property dualism is the denial of a kind of physicalism. Um, Physicalism is an extreme form of materialism, though a popular one. It's the view that the universe consists entirely of atoms in the void, or particles in fields, or hyperdimensional superstrings, or whatever physics ultimately settles upon as the terms of the most fundamental causal transactions. These basic physical entities do not include minds or anything remotely mental, and everything that happens in the universe boils down to nothing but mindless physical interactions among these basic entities. That's uh, that's a view that's very popular, and it's called physicalism amongst philosophers anyway. Now, boiling down to uh, implies being determined by, supervening upon, being explained by. Um, if something supervenes on something else, if the mental supervenes upon the physical, then there's no differences in the mental features of a situation without some differences in the fundamental physical features that could, in principle, explain those differences. So that is the physicalist position. Everything boils down to fundamental physical stuff, and there's no mentality down there. Mentality comes much later. Property dualism says, on the contrary, that phenomenal properties at least don't boil down to, they're not fully determined by, they're not fully explained by the fundamental physical properties of things. So why doubt physicalism? Why suppose that some phenomenal properties do not boil down to physics? Well, the arguments that philosophers take seriously for this are the most common ones anyway, are based on thought experiments. And you might have doubts about thought experiments, but let's try to roll with it for the time being. Thought experiments that are supposed to show that we can just see that the mental and the physical are distinct kinds of properties. So one of these thought experiments involves Mary, the neuroscientist in the black and white laboratory. This is a thought experiment that was uh, uh, articulated by Howard Robinson and Frank Jackson, but it goes back. It's an ancient idea. In Jackson's version, he asks us to think about a neuroscientist who's raised in a black and white environment somehow. She studies vision science in her black and white lab, learns everything there is to know about how visual processing works, as described in terms of the light reflectance of surfaces, the way rods and cones work, neural activity, information processing, whatever there is relevant to our experience of color, she knows about. Um, so she would know that when someone would experience a color that they call orange, the color of the color of ripe oranges and so on. She'd know under what circumstances that would happen. Um, she knows that when sunlight strikes this kind of surface, it's going to cause an experience in me. I'm going to say orange. Um, but would she have an experience of orange? Not necessarily. I mean, given what I told you, she's raised in a black and white environment. She reads black and white books, and so on. She could know all this stuff about rods and cones and what people are going to say, um, without ever having had the experience of orange. That little orange in the head is the experience of orange, obviously. That's what it looks like. Um, well, what is that supposed to tell us? Um, that there's a further fact about what color experience is like. And you could know all the stuff about physics, everything that's that's everything that's determined by fundamental physics. You could know all of that without knowing what it's like. Um, Zombies. Some of you have probably encountered zombies, hopefully not in real life, but philosophical zombies are uh, creatures who are just like us in terms of our uh, sensitivity to light, in terms of our processing information. And they say things like, oh, look, that's an orange, but the lights aren't on. There's no experience there. Now, I'm not going to demand that you take that seriously, but a better, I think, more intuitive thought experiment is the possibility of spectral inversion of our color experiences, but also of other phenomenal uh, uh, modes of experience, such as tastes and sounds and so on. So in spectral inversion, there's the swapping of a range of experiences in a systematic way, while imagining that the fundamental physics of the brain and the environment remain the same. To work up to this, think about goggles that inverted the spectrum of light that strikes your eyes, so that when others see this, um, that's red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, the person with the goggles sees this: violet, indigo, blue, etc. So when you see stop signs, they look red to you, but they look violet to the goggle wearers. Now imagine someone who's always worn the goggles. They would use the same color words as us in the same circumstances, but their experiences would be systematically different. So it's certainly possible to have systematically uh, different experiences, but be sensitive to the same phenomena in your environment. Color inversion could happen with goggles, but it could also happen within the eyes if someone fiddled with your eyes. It could happen in the optic nerve if someone fiddled with the optic nerve, or even further in the brain's processing of color experience. When you think about the blind spot that's where we're not taking in information from the environment on our retina, that spot is filled in with a color that's appropriate to the surrounding color. And that doesn't happen in the eyes. Presumably it doesn't happen in the optical nerve. It happens somewhere later. So that bit of color anyway is not filled in until much later. So why couldn't our color experience be inverted much further back, after the goggles, after the eyes, after the uh, optical nerve? Um, Whatever neural firings ultimately cause your experience, isn't it at least abstractly possible that your experience had been similar to that of the person with the inverting goggles? Didn't God have a choice of which spectrum to associate with events like those in your brain now? Now, this isn't skepticism. I'm not saying for all we know, we're all seeing different colors, though no doubt there's individual differences. It's the claim that there's no necessary connection between firings of neurons and the felt experience of color. Many philosophers say, well, there must be some such connection, it's just opaque to us. But others say, no, when you think hard about this, we can't see any necessary connection here. And in the early days of psychophysics, it was just assumed there's a contingent law of nature, that brains functioning like mine right now see blue instead of yellow. And if that's right, our brains could have been functioning as they are now, but generating different color qualia. Presumably the same goes for other phenomenal experiences like smells, tastes, sounds, the what it's like aspect of sensory experiences. So if inversions are really possible, there is an aspect to experience, the phenomenal aspect, that must be something over and above the purely chemical events going on in the brain, which are fully determined by the fundamental physics. So these phenomenal aspects of our minds must be something over and above the fundamental physical properties and anything that's fully determined by them. So these events somehow give rise to experiences with new properties or features, ones that aren't merely physical. Now, this raises a question about these new properties, these not entirely physical properties, the ones that would be different in color inversion, the ones that would be different if salty things tasted sweet and sweet things tasted salty. We can ask, where are they? What has them? What are the things that have them? If we think of the phenomenal aspects of our experience as mental paint, this additional something that's there because we're conscious, where does it go? Here's our picture. Let's do something a little bit different with it. Here's a person experiencing red in the normal sort of way when they see an orange. But if they put on inverting goggles, the orange looks indigo. For now, changing the color inside the head, that just means the orange now appears indigo to this person. It doesn't mean there's an indigo round thing in the person's head, okay? And the little arrow there just is representing the inverting effect of the goggles. Now, one thing you might think, is that putting the glasses on makes the orange look different because it throws some kind of paint onto the orange. But we know that that's not how goggles work, right? That would be a kind of projection theory of phenomenal color that says if it looks indigo to you, that means there's some special indigo paint that's thrown out there. But of course, that's not how goggles work. They don't affect the surface of the orange. Similarly, for inversions that happen after the light strikes the eye, say if you did some kind of surgery on my eyes so that my spectrum experience was inverted, that wouldn't throw paint out onto the orange. Um, and nor if it was a difference that happened further back in my neural processing. If this phenomenal experience of indigo is something that can vary, that could have been inverted, could have been switched with orange, even without changing anything in my brain. If God had made the laws of qualia different, that also wouldn't pitch the indigo out onto the surfaces of objects. So I think that projection theory of where the qualia goes is just a really bad theory. And nobody really believes that. But where is the difference then precisely? Where does the mental paint go if it's not spread on the orange? Is there a spherical or circular surface in my brain that's different than it would be were my color experience inverted? There was a popular view inherited from people like David Hume, which held that when you see an orange, a round entity, not a part of your brain, but just a round thing, was created that had orange mental paint on it. Um, and if your experience was inverted for whatever reason, then there would be an indigo mental round mental thing generated with the mental paint on it. That was a view that was called the sense datum theory early in the 20th century. Um, and at least for some sense modalities, it's an implausible view. It's implausible to posit this private entity that's distinct from me with the mental paint on it. It also seems implausible to suppose that there's this circular round surface in my brain that has the red or the orange or the indigo paint on it. With some kinds of phenomenal experience like taste, it's not at all plausible to suppose that the taste is a mental thing that's generated by by my brain, or that there's a part of my brain that tastes a certain way. To taste a salty taste isn't to be related to something with a tasty property, something that isn't a food or a condiment, but a mental thing. To taste a salty taste is like dancing a waltz or kicking a high, swift kick. These are ways of dancing, ways of kicking, not things that you're related to by dancing them or by kicking them. So on this way of thinking about taste, tasting a salty taste is an activity. And the saltiness is a modification of your tasting. It's not a relation between you and something else. If this is the right way to think about phenomenal properties in general, to sense an indigo round patch of color is to sense in an indigo-ish, roundish fashion. This is often called the adverbialist theory of appearing, of the way things appear. It's the view that the qualia that give my experiences their phenomenal characters are properties of myself. They're not properties of something to which I'm related. They're not relations between me and something else. It's called an adverbial theory because to say that I taste a salty taste is a way of saying I taste in a salty way, saltily, or something like that. To experience in a reddish way is to sense redly, as you might put it. But it's a mode of my experiencing. It's a mode of me. What inversions, zombies, and the Mary argument are supposed to show is that perfectly natural that phenomenal properties are perfectly natural, that they are extra something, an extra aspect of things, and since it can't be explained in terms of the fundamental physical stuff, it's got to be a new kind of thing that's perfectly natural. Now, what do I mean by naturalness? Um, Natural properties are ones that are responsible for the most fundamental respects in which things resemble one another. They Naturalness comes in degrees. Plato introduced a metaphor of cutting nature at the joints. Contemporary metaphysicians use the term natural property for those joints, for objective resemblance in extremely precise respects. So if a property is natural, it's responsible for one of the ways in which things objectively resemble one another. Since it's not all or nothing, you can have more or less natural properties, more or less natural ways of resembling. So schemes of classification have more or less natural classes in them. We can make generalizations about the similarities and differences among the English, the Scottish, the Irish, and the Welsh, even though belonging to the same ethnic group does not ensure much objective similarity. Ethnicity isn't highly natural, but it's not completely unnatural either. If you want to know all the ways in which things resemble one another, you have to, let's see, I think I've gotten myself on the wrong. Yeah, got to the wrong. There, now I'm back. Okay. Um, if you want the perfectly natural properties, the ones that are responsible for the most fundamental respects in which things can objectively resemble one another, you have to look at uh, the the minimal and most fundamental features of things. Minimal in the sense that if you have them all, you can settle all of the resemblances. So they're enough to give you to assure you that you have duplicates if you have all of these the perfectly natural properties in common. So if you accept these thought experiments about Mary, about inverted spectra, you think that the fundamental physical properties aren't enough to tell you whether two things are duplicates. You have to throw in these new phenomenal properties. They're identifiable in our experience. They don't boil down to fundamental, purely physical properties. I think it's a dead end to suppose that they might boil down to something else, non-physical properties of matter. But I'm not going to talk about that because I can tell I'm running out of time. So if they can't boil down to some other non-physical properties of matter, then they have to be among the most fundamental properties that there are. So there's just basic laws about when brains are like, so boom, the lights come on and we have reddish experiences, salty tastes, and so on. This is ruling out that idea that there might be non-physical properties of matter that are somehow more fundamental than these phenomenal things. And I think we can imagine inversion thought experiments there as well. So let's forget about that. So what do I mean by property dualism then? We can define this idea more precisely now. It's the idea that there's a family of perfectly natural properties, the qualia, in virtue of which experiences are phenomenally similar or different. And these are the kinds of properties that we're imagining to be permuted in inverted spectrum cases. We're imagining that they're absent in zombies. We're imagining that they're unknown by Mary, even though she knows all of the purely physical properties of things. These kinds of thought experiments have convinced a lot of philosophers that property dualism is true. Until recently, I'd say it was taken to be a kind of truism that phenomenal color, phenomenal smell, taste, and so on were distinct from the physical properties of matter. By recently here, I mean, let's say 1930. Now, how seriously should we take these thought experiments? Let me try to make it seem a little better than you might have thought. Um, they're supposed to help us see that non-phenomenal properties of matter, those are one thing, and that they're just that um, uh, the fundamental physical properties of matter uh, included in these non-phenomenal properties of matter don't determine the phenomenal properties that we have. Um, Compare that to the following situation in which all the matter that you've got comes in two kinds. You've got your cubes and you've got your spheres, and they bounce around. And the spheres weigh 1 gram, the cubes weigh 2 grams. This is detectable by how much uh, how they affect one another. Um, Now, even if it was just a law of nature that they always came together, being spherical and being 1 gram, being a cube and being 2 grams, if you think about it, you can imagine a world where the cubes are 1 gram and the spheres are 2 grams. I'm not sure if the texture that I put on these images is showing up, but I just swapped the texture. So there's the texture is the one way, the texture is the other. That was supposed to represent the mass of these things. Um, Thinking about it shows that these are distinct because you can imagine the opposite. And so shape and mass are two things, even if they were lawfully connected with one another. Okay. So that's supposed to help make the thought experiments seem like they really show something. So that's one kind of dualism, property dualism, one kind of materialism, physicalism. You can be a property dualist without taking a further step towards a more robust sort of dualism. Property dualism is compatible with a kind of materialism. Um, Substance dualism is the view that no conscious human person is composed of the kinds of physical stuff that makes up rocks and trees and the bodies of animals. So, on this view, which is stronger than property dualism, um, I don't have physical properties at all, at least not of the kind that uh, ordinary matter has. I have thoughts, I have sensations, I'm closely associated with, I'm dependent upon a living human body, but the core of who I am is not material. Now, there are other kinds of dualism out there, but this is the kind that I have in mind. I think it's the most defensible. Um, Substance materialism is the view that each human person is an object made entirely out of the kinds of physical stuff that make up rocks, trees, and other non-sentient things. You don't need any extra thing outside of the body to get a conscious person. Now, we should be careful to compare the most plausible versions of dualism and the most plausible versions of materialism, and not caricature or create a straw man, a straw person. Um, I think the most plausible form of substance dualism is uh, going to say the ability to think and act is radically dependent upon embodiment. It would fly in the face of experience to claim that my ability to think and act is not radically dependent upon the proper functioning of my brain and upon my being embodied. How few mental properties should the emergent dualist ascribe to souls as intrinsic to the soul itself? Well, the safest thing is probably to say precious few besides conscious mental states uh, and imaginings, which seem very similar to uh, phenomenal states. Um, and if we want to think of ourselves as actors, then acts of will should belong to the thinking thing, the thing that's conscious. But much of our um, cognitive abilities, our character, our memories, and the like, uh, may be entirely dependent upon neurological states. Um, so we should allow that that's quite possible. Um, it would also seem best to regard humans as continuous in nature with the rest of the sentient animal kingdom. Um, all of this can be preserved by a view William Hasker has dubbed emergent dualism, according to which when organisms have sufficiently complex nervous systems to generate consciousness, they automatically also generate a non-physical substance located somewhere within the nervous system to be the subject of that consciousness. Souls on this view are naturally emergent, and all sentient animals have souls. So we'll call this emergent dualism. I think it's the most plausible kind of dualism. What's the most plausible kind of materialism? Well, it would be the view that I'm an ordinary physical object, one of the things I already believe in. Um, my parts should include at least the parts of my body upon which thinking depend. Now, the ordinary physical objects are things like bodies, this whole body, my brain, one hemisphere of my brain, things like that. Um, if there were if you posited some new kind of substance, some kind of something with a different sort of mass, a different kind of charge, a different sort of field that had physical properties and mental properties, well, that would be a kind of dualism, and so I think we might as well ignore that. Um, so we'll call this standard or garden variety materialism. Uh, Now, the garden variety objects, ordinary objects we already believed in, are things, as I said, like organisms, brains, one hemisphere of a brain. Those are the things that are ordinary objects that my thinking uh, 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 depends upon. Um, these are all vague objects. When you look closely at them, they're like clouds, or they're like Eddington's table. When you zoom in on the table, there's a bunch of particles ricocheting around. Um, where does the cloud end and the surrounding atmosphere begin? Well, that's vague. There's a lot of indeterminacy there. And if you look at organisms and brains closely, they are vague objects too, not unlike rivers or clouds. They have vague boundaries because there's no fact of the matter when a particular a particular uh, molecule is captured by a cell and pulled into it. When does it become a part of the body? Um, Choosing a precise instant uh, would be like choosing a precise instant when a molecule of H2O joins a cloud or leaves the Mississippi River to enter the Gulf of Mexico. These are matters for stipulation. Of course, these are more rapid processes in our bodies, but they're not different in principle. So where we have vague boundaries, I'm going to assume we have many things that are good candidates for being the river or the cloud or the body or the brain, but we haven't stipulated the precise boundaries of these things. We could have, just like we could stipulate precise boundaries for the where the river ends and the Gulf of Mexico begins. But we don't bother because we are not detecting these subtle differences, and they don't matter for most purposes. But if I'm a vague object for which there are many equally good candidates, each must be conscious if each is as good a candidate for being me as the others. If consciousness were just a certain kind of computation, on the other hand, as opposed to property dualism, it would be plausible to suppose that the host of objects located in the vicinity of my brain would all be conscious. After all, each has the brain as a part. And if it's essentially a computer, they're running the same program. But suppose the adverbialist property dualist theory of qualia is true. My phenomenal properties are new, they're fundamental features of the world, and I'm the thing that has them. So if I'm a garden variety object like a brain and I'm tasting a sweet taste, then all the good candidates for being my brain must have this fundamental feature, lawfully produced by sugar on the tongue and then the brain processing that follows it. But there's no reason to think that the laws of consciousness generation, because we're supposing they're fundamental laws now, will pick out exactly the candidates we're interested in, just those clouds of particles that are the size and shape of an organism or even a brain. Property dualism requires basic phenomenal laws linking brain states with phenomenal fields. And as a slogan, fundamental laws should be about fundamental things. They should not be expected to hold between the physical causes of phenomenal experience and vague objects with fuzzy borders, borders we could have made more or less precise by stipulation. What are the options, though, if I'm not a garden variety physical object? One of these ordinary things I'd already believed in. Well, I might be a physically special material object, but that's not a very good hypothesis. You might suppose there's a natural physical boundary, but it would be one that doesn't correspond to the rough and ready boundaries that we draw for organisms, organs, and so on. But we don't see anything like that in the brain. You might suppose I'm a physically unnatural but psychically special material object. Now, this is a kind of a weird view. I should explain what I'm thinking of here is if you suppose the brain generates tasting saltiness, tasting sweetness, being undergoing an experience of reddish experience, you might think the brain just ascribes this to whatever chunk of the brain is particularly involved in that processing. And what makes that part of the brain special is that it has this feature now. But then you would have to suppose you're kind of jumping around in your brain. And unless you have a very special kind of metaphysics, that just doesn't make sense. The physical object that jumps around from one hunk of matter to another. So that's not very good either. The third possibility, I'm a new object. And that, of course, is dualism. The brain generates a new thing to be the bearer of the qualia. Now, the first two are very weird, and they're as weird as substance dualism, at least, I think. And substance dualism shouldn't be that surprising. It shouldn't be surprising that a new fundamental properties would require new fundamental subjects. So for anyone who accepts property dualism, substance dualism should not seem like an extravagant hypothesis. Okay. So that's why, given that I do accept those thought experiments, the Mary story, the inverted spectrum story, I'm a property dualist. Because I'm a property dualist, I don't think substance dualism is that bizarre. Then because I'm a Christian, I think that there's special reasons to be a property dualist. And I also think there's special reasons to be a substance dualist. So let me just quickly run through these. Here's the special reasons that we have to be property dualists. To know what colors and smells are like, one must be able to have some kinds of sensory experiences. This is a kind of concept empiricism. Now, this could be questioned, and I'm not entirely sure that it's true, but it is a venerable position, and it doesn't say that you have to smell every smell in order to have a concept of that smell, or experience every color to have a concept of that color, but that to know what colors are, you have to have some color experience. Of course, God knows what colors and smells are like, so God can have experiences like ours, and no doubt many others that we could never have. If that's right, conscious experiences can be shared by us and a mind that is not made of matter or any other kind of stuff. Having these conscious experiences cannot then be a matter of having an inner computer running a certain program or anything like that. It's got to be some further feature of minds. You can have a thing that's finite, like me, and you can have and complex and with many parts, perhaps, and it's similar to a mind in a qualia way, in the phenomenal way. It's similar to a mind that's not made of anything at all. This must be some non-physical kind of similarity. We also have special theological reasons, I think, to be substance dualists, based on our expectation of temporary disembodied existence. Okay, well, let's go back a second. Christians, at least many of us, have this reason. And I think it should tip the balance for us in favor of dualism. Christians, of course, differ in their attitudes towards the authority of Scripture. They endorse different hermeneutical methods and adhere to different creeds and theological traditions. Some theologians regard a personal creator God, an empty tomb, and the general resurrection of the dead as primitive elements of the faith that can be discarded without touching the heart of the Christian gospel. I'm not like that. But those kinds of Christians will be unmoved by the considerations I'm about to raise. It matters to me what Jesus and the writers of the New Testament believed about the nature of human persons and their post-mortem destinies, in a way that it doesn't matter to me what they believed about how old the earth is, or whether the sun goes around the earth, and so on. Why? Well, because I believe these views about persons and post-mortem existence were relevant to the question of what they meant when teaching the earliest Christ followers about life after death and what it means. So John Cooper has written a very nice book, Body, Soul, and Life Everlasting. I had to look over to where it sits on my shelf. In which he argues that the New Testament writers make their dualism quite explicit in the Gospels and Epistles, that it was the view of the intertestamental period amongst pious Jews, and it shows up when important theological points are being made. So it can't be easily brushed aside as window dressing. Some biblical scholars, like Oscar Cullmann, N.T. Wright, are famously say the view of the Jewish conception of persons and the afterlife was very, very different than the Platonistic idea of a naturally immortal soul, and so on. And they're right to do this. But when you look closely at what Oscar Cullmann and N.T. Wright believe about the nature of persons, they say, we are not dualists. Dualism is false. But by my accounting, my way of thinking about it, they are dualists. They believe that people can exist without bodies in a conscious state awaiting the resurrection. I think the possibility of an intermediate disembodied state just requires a dualism of person and body. If right now materialism were true of me, then my suddenly becoming disembodied would require that something could lose all of its parts at once and continue to exist made of other stuff. And that just seems impossible. If I can't lose all my parts at once, but I can lose all my physical parts at once, then in order for me to exist through disembodiment, something that's non-physical must already be a part of me. So I already have a non-physical part. This is a kind of argument that depends upon a principle that Richard Swinburne calls the Aristotelian principle of substances. You can't lose all your parts at once. Furthermore, since when I am disembodied, that thing is going to be all of me, it is then going to have to be identical with me. There's nothing else there. It's got to be me. And the following is a kind of philosophical truism. Once you're identical with the thing, you're always identical to it. You can't stop being identical to it. That's just the way identity works. So if there's this guy, Pastor Gibson of San Francisco, he's one of the candidates for being Jack the Ripper. If he ever was identical with Jack the Ripper, then he's always identical with Jack the Ripper. Even if he never kills anybody else again, he was the killer. And if he dies in a certain place, Jack the Ripper dies in that place. Um, so uh, that's why I think disembodied existence, the possibility of it, the actual occurrence of it, I think, requires that I now am a non physical thing. Now, of course, some Christian scholars, sometimes precisely to avoid this result, are skeptical about whether human beings exist during a period intermediate between death and resurrection, or they suppose that the resurrection happens immediately somewhere else. Um, but when I find the doctrine of intermediate disembodied existence pretty clearly affirmed in places where the New Testament writers seem to be trying to convey theological truths, I'm reluctant to give it up. Okay, so let me sum up. Property dualism is, I've said, plausible. It's not just a tiny minority view among philosophers, it's intuitive, and Christians have special reasons to believe it. If property dualism is plausible, so is substance dualism. Materialism is most intuitively appealing when it attributes consciousness to physical objects we're already familiar with, things we already believe in, like organisms or brains. Then you could say there's no reason to suppose that some peculiar new entity is the locus of consciousness. But property dualism makes it seem just wrong to attribute consciousness to organisms and brains. They're vague objects, and it would be parochial to suppose that the laws governing consciousness favor them over other things. We should not suppose that the phenomenon of consciousness is bestowed upon these vague, large-scale objects. Human persons then are either peculiar physical objects or something entirely new in the world that arises with consciousness. Now, I haven't talked about supposedly powerful scientific or philosophical arguments against substance dualism, and I'm not going to have time to do that. But I just say that so far I haven't found such arguments overwhelming. Most of them are aimed at highly Platonistic views, according to which souls are outside of space, or souls are naturally immortal, or able to think better without brains than with them. And none of those doctrines seem at all relevant to the things that make dualism attractive to me. Substance dualism is required by a doctrine that is central to Christianity, uh, namely survival of death, followed by a later resurrection. So I remain strongly inclined towards substance dualism, and apparently, judging from this event, I'm not afraid to say it and even be recorded on Zoom saying it. Thanks.
Thank you, Dean, for that thought-provoking presentation that I suspect challenged many of our mental states.
Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman, for your talk. Let me, for the time being, completely assume a dualistic worldview. My question then becomes, when does an embryo obtain a soul? Or when does a physical body become dualistic?
Yeah, that is $1 million question. Um, the if I mean the short answer is I have no idea, right? What really the laws are that connect qualia with their basis, what those laws look like, um, I I don't really know because of course we don't really know when consciousness exactly kicks in and when we just merely have behavior that that is somewhat attuned to the environment. Um, but I think given the similarity of chimpanzee brains to human brains, they should have qualia that are similar to ours. So they should have souls that are similar to ours, and so on down through the animal kingdom. And presumably there are points where you've got animals that are not conscious um, ever. Um, maybe. I mean, I'm not even sure of that. Pretty sure plants aren't. I don't think we have any reason, because there isn't anything like a nervous system there. So, um, but we really don't know um, uh, how things feel to other creatures with slightly different brains and so on. And I think we should say the same thing about the human brain as it becomes more and more complex. Um, to deny that babies have feelings, to deny that the fetus has feelings when there's a brain and a nervous system and responses that are similar to ours is crazy, I think. So there's got to be, if qualia mean there's a soul, there's got to be a soul there. When does consciousness begin? Uh, well, quite early, I think. I mean, there's responses to negative stimuli and so on very early. Now, how early could the soul appear? Um, could it appear? Could it, be generated by the activity of this embryo, or the the early stages before there's uh, uh, differentiation among the cells and so on? Could it already be there? Well, it's possible. Maybe the laws of soul generation don't say merely when there's enough activity for there to be qualia, there's a soul, but rather when there's the kind of life form that uh, would end up having qualia, there's automatically a soul. That's a possibility. In that case, the soul could be there very early on. But myself, I suspect that qualia and the first qualia, or the ability to experience and the soul, come together. But I really don't know. And I think this is if there are these extra fundamental subjects and the only way to know about them directly is to be one, it's going to be very hard to tell from the outside when you have a conscious person and when you don't. And of course, this led people like Descartes to do crazy things like deny that animals were conscious and say, well, it's just a robot. Well, of course, he didn't say robot, but a waxwork figure. It's a mechanical thing. So I don't know. Do you want to follow up that question? I realize I'm sort of punting on it.
Well, one thing that I think you said was that perhaps chimpanzees may have souls.
Certainly.
And if that is the case, uh, how are humans and not chimpanzees made in the image of God? Or would you conclude that chimpanzees are also made in the image of God?
So I think experience, having, feeling pain, being able to smell, and these are the phenomenal aspects of experience. Those I don't think are what make us to be bearers of God's image. Um, we're bearers of God's image in virtue of being uh, uh, rational beings, and having a certain amount of freedom, not God's kind of freedom, but a certain amount of freedom. Um, and those are much more important aspects of us. Those are due, I think, not just to the powers of the soul by itself, but to the powers of a soul united with a functioning brain. Cognition requires the brain to be doing its thing, whatever that thing is exactly. So I think the bearer, when we bear God's image most concretely, we are awake and alert and reasoning and acting freely and responsibly. And that's something that the soul isn't able to do by itself. And it's something that chimpanzee souls can't do, even with their very, very wonderful chimpanzee brains.
Thank you for your thought-provoking talk.
Thanks.
All right, Scott Buchanan, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, hi. Thanks for this presentation. I'm just curious. You didn't, in your main talk, you didn't address the kind of physicalist arguments against dualism. And I'm not a philosopher, but I'm aware. I'm a scientist, and for most scientists, they have this gut feeling that because pretty much every conscious, every thought, every mental experience, every qualia is kind of one-to-one tied with physical actions in your brain. They just find it very hard to see that there's anything other than the brain. I mean, if some scientist pokes at your brain with electrodes, they can make you experience things. So you can probably articulate the arguments against dualism, but would you care to kind of steel man on a physicalist argument against dualism and to show how you shoot it down in flames?
I don't. Yeah, if I build it up properly, I won't be able to shoot it down in flames. I think, yeah, so we have this expectation that there will be neural correlates of conscious states, and that if we better understood how the brain works, I mean, we can know things about the parts of the brain, systems within the brain that are more involved in one sense modality than in another, and in one type of thinking rather than in another. So we can know some of that kind of thing. And I guess the conviction is that for every type of phenomenal state, there's going to be a type of brain state that causes it, I guess. Now, where that conviction comes from exactly, I think that's a good working hypothesis, and we should assume that something like it is true. But now, how does that turn into an argument against property dualism? One of my teachers, Jagwan Kim, developed an argument along these sorts of lines, where if there's always a sufficiently explanatory brain event that could be described physically, whenever there's the taste of saltiness, let's say, and if there was always and whenever there was the taste of saltiness, there was a physical event that could only generate saltiness, then that brain event is good enough to explain everything that we do without appealing to a further event of, having that salty taste, which is a non-physical event. So you don't need that intervening property. You could just, explain everything in terms of this type of neural event, which causes, the property dualist says that causes the salty flavor, and the physicalist says, no, that just is salty taste, and we don't need this further intervening property. And I mean but that requires that, that creatures that are very I mean, if the neurochemical event is specific to our brains, that means that other, creatures couldn't taste salt. There is something very unintuitive about the identification of saltiness with a particular neurochemical event that's peculiar to humans. And this leads some philosophers to say, right, we can't identify this mental event with that kind of physical event, but it's a functional kind. And so functionalism is a theory in the philosophy of mind that's meant to be consistent with physicalism, but not identifying the feeling with a particular neurochemical event that's peculiar to human brains. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling here. Let me see if I can get back to your
Does that
request.
Answer anything for you, Scott?
Yeah, but partly, and kind of related to that is I've read, physicalists just sort of waving away our experiences as epiphenomena. And
Right.
Can you define what they would mean by, is epiphenomena just something that they wish would go away and they can't quite make it go away, so we plaster this name over it?
I mean, I think there's a couple things that go on there. I mean, so the classic epiphenomenalist says, yes, the feeling is something over and above the physical, but it doesn't do anything. Now that is a dualist position. But more recent views that are kind of epiphenomenal-ish are like Dennett's kind of picture of things, where yes, we do these thought experiments that give us the feeling that there's this further aspect to our experience which is not identical with any physical feature of our brains. But those are just stories, and they're fictions. And there really isn't anything like that. There just is the neurochemical stuff, and the talk about red after images which look just like a red stop sign. That's just a fiction. There isn't any such thing as a red after image that looks just like a red stop sign, and these things have nothing in common. And that feels to me like the view that we really are zombies, but we tell ourselves a story according to which we're not zombies.
Yeah, so I've heard Dennett's book Consciousness Explained, subtitled Consciousness Explained Away.
It does feel like that to me. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Dean, I'd like to ask a question about the difference between property dualism and emergent dualism. My understanding is that in property dualism, the mental states are non-material entities, but they are dependent on the physical body. Whereas in emergent dualism, while it arises from the physical body, it's not wholly dependent on the physical body, so that after death, it can continue to persist. Am I right about that difference?
That's not exactly the distinction that I was going for, but these are terms of art, really. And especially the word emergent and emergence, this gets used in, a half a dozen really different ways. So it's understandable that these views get a little fuzzy. Let me see if I can let me put it this way. Property dualism is the view that um, the mental aspects of things, the experiential aspects in particular, are not fully determined by underlying physical aspects of things, which means that it just means that you could have a world that was exactly the same physically, but the color experiences were inverted, but everything there could be physical. So property dualism is consistent with supposing that it's little physical pebbles that have the mental states, or that it's brains that have the mental states. So it's really just a thesis about the independence of mental properties like feeling pain, feeling hunger, and it doesn't say anything about what has them. And it's totally consistent with property dualism to say property dualism uh, uh, doesn't, the dualistic properties are epiphenomenal. They don't do anything. They're always generated by, caused to be exemplified by physical states. Property dualism is consistent with a substance dualism too, including like a Cartesian dualism, where the soul is this extra thing that's not in space and doesn't have any other properties, and it's naturally immortal. So property dualism sort of doesn't care about that distinction between, materialism about me and dualism about me. Now, emergent dualism is the view that it's a view about what I am. It's a view that, according to which I don't have physical parts. I'm not made out of bodily stuff, but I do have mental states. And the difference between this view and Cartesianism or Platonistic views about the soul is that emergent dualism says souls are dependent for their existence on brains. So brains generate them in the way that a magnet generates a field. That's one of Hasker's metaphors. So the field is different from the magnet because the field is moving things around out there. It's moving the iron filings at a distance from itself, from the magnet. So the field is one thing, the magnet's another. The emergent soul is one thing, the brain is another, but the brain naturally generates these things. And in lower animals, those brains also naturally generate consciousness and naturally generate a thing that to bear those conscious properties. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. But so I'm just trying to get at then what happens when we die. A physical, right, property dualist, and you've actually proposed the falling elevator model, right, to explain how a property dualist can continue, whereas an emergent dualist, the soul could continue without requiring the body to continue, right?
Yeah. So um, so one thing I like to do is try to show that, particular Christian doctrines are consistent. They can be put together with many, many different views.
Mm-hmm.
So what Brian is referring to is an attempt to show that you could be a property dualist, or it doesn't have to be a property dualist. You can be a materialist, somebody who thinks that you're an organism, and still believe that you somehow survive death by supposing that this body sort of generates a new one somewhere else, a physical body, and that would count as the same body as long as it happened right when you die. Now, this is a kind of fanciful story, and I think there are actually, there's philosophical objections to it. So I don't really like that story, but it's a story that I think if you're a materialist, you should already accept some of the stuff that I don't accept, and so maybe it'll work for you. But that's a view, that where God has to work a miracle on this animal when it's dying in order to enable that animal to appear somewhere else, where the animal has no soul. It's just an organism without a soul. I'm offering that to people who believe that we're merely organisms and we don't have souls. But on the emergent dualist picture, the soul is generated by a brain. And I think the most natural thing to think is that for it to continue to exist naturally, the brain has to continue to exist, so that it would require a miracle to preserve you when your body dies. But that also, I don't think, is surprising or should bother us. I think, we shouldn't be surprised if we're extremely fragile things, and that for us to survive, God has to keep us in being in some kind of miraculous way. Especially if, as I'm thinking of it, our natural state is united with the body, constantly interacting with it tightly, so that we can't really do anything without it. So to keep us going, God would have to work miracles, and until we get back in our natural state, which requires the resurrection.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question. Peter Payne, you want to unmute yourself and ask it?
Yeah, I had a number of different thoughts, but one is John Searle kind of avoids the Daniel Dennett view that quality don't really exist. You think you have experiences that are different than simply complex dispositions to behave, neurons firing. That's just an illusion. So John Searle says that's ridiculous. Intelligent people saying things which are so foolish as to think that the feeling of pain is just pain behavior or dispositions to behave that way. And so his position is that qualia really do exist, but they're just high-level emergent properties, like air pressure would be an emergent property of all these molecules, or solidity, liquidity, those kinds of things would be higher-level properties. And then when the brain is functioning a certain kind of way, it gives rise to these experiences, which are not reducible down to the parts. But at the same time, he says there's nothing there but the atoms, the electrons, the molecules, all that kind of thing. And the difficulty I see with it, if there's nothing there but the atoms, the molecules, then all the causal power has to lie with those things. Those are the things which influence the next state of the brain. If you have an emergent property that is just this, is no different than the physical parts that are there, then the next state of the brain is completely determined by the physical interactions that underlie the emergent property, say, of a feeling of pain. But the feeling of pain by itself has no causal impact on the future of the brain. Thomas Nagel argues that that's very unlikely, and that the feeling of pain has no causal effect on future events because it's so ubiquitous amongst all the higher organisms. So surely there must be some survival value, and survival value is connected with causal efficacy of some sort. So it seems to me that John Searle has got himself in a difficulty by saying there's nothing but the electrons, et cetera, that there, but nonetheless there's higher order property, and that it really does make it kind of epiphenomenal-like, in that the actual fact of feeling a pain is no causal influence on future states of the brain. And hence you have this rather odd, implausible view and that the feeling of pain has no survival value for any higher organisms.
So, Peter, what's your question then?
My question is, I want you to respond to this idea that John Searle's view of emergent properties, that there's nothing but the physics which is there. It arises from it. It's different from it. It's not reducible down to it. But my thought is that they don't have any. There's no causal power to the actual quality of themselves or the experiences. Have you heard that before? What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with most of what you say. That Searle wants to sort of have his cake and eat it too, and I think that there isn't a stable position there. So I think I agree with Nagel's critique, if I remember it correctly.
Okay. Well, we need to bring this session to a close. I want to thank Dean Zimmerman again for being our keynote speaker this evening, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this presentation of the affiliation of Christian biologists and the affiliation of ministers, theologians, and philosophers of the ASA. Our next online event in this series is scheduled for January 14th, so you're going to have to wait 2 months for our next one. William Newsom, who I think I saw logged in to this session, he's a Christian neuroscientist at Stanford University who will be giving a presentation on the neuroscience of human consciousness and its relevance to free will and moral development. If you're interested in getting more information on the ACB, AMTAP, or the parent organization, the American Scientific Affiliation, send us an email at asa@asa3.org. Again, that's asa@asa3, the number 3.org. As we close out this evening in prayer, I'd like to ask Walter Rohiro, the president of the affiliation of ministers, theologians, and philosophers, to lead us in prayer.
Let's bow our heads together. Lord, we pray that you would help us to use everything that we've heard and learned tonight for your kingdom and your glory. And Lord, no matter what our views of the human person is, whether they're monist, dualist, or even some other position, we pray that you would make us truly human, Lord, through the resurrection and the redemption of your Son, through the drawing and the indwelling of your Spirit. And Lord God, especially in these unprecedented days where so many in our world are afraid and others exultant for the same reasons, help us be peacemakers and effective navigators of these times. People who are witnesses of your truth and your love, of your goodness and your kingdom, and articulate not only in our views, but Lord God, most of all, in the way that you have transformed us, that we might be transforming agents in this world. We pray your blessing on the ASA, on these various affiliations, and on every person who's here tonight. And we pray your blessing in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Well, watch for updates on our upcoming events. And also check out the ACB group on Facebook and LinkedIn. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
See you next time.